evening, fellows of the Academy, associates of the Academy, and other persons who may have joined to hear Professor Abhijeet Banerjee this evening. This is the mid-year meeting of the Indian Academy of Sciences, and in each of these meetings we have a public lecture by a very eminent person. And today we are actually proud and honored that Professor Abhijeet Banerjee has kindly accepted to deliver this talk, which he has titled "Getting Out of a Poverty Trap." Like a commoner, I will say that Professor Abhijeet Banerjee is a Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences. He has written 2 books, co-authored with his wife. One book, which is called Poor Economics, that has won the Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year. And the second book is Good Economics for Hard Times. He is, of course, as all of us know, very eminent. He has served on very eminent committees. I will not be able to name all of them. He served on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda. Professor Banerjee has also made 2 documentary films. Currently, he is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the MIT. He co-founded the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. He has been a past president of the Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Econometric Society. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, an Alfred P. Sloan Fellow, and a winner of the Infosys Prize. Again, we are very grateful that Professor Banerjee can be with us this evening. I know that he's in Paris now, but he kindly made time to meet with us and to deliver this lecture titled Getting Out of the Poverty Trap. Thank you, Professor Banerjee. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me to speak to this distinguished audience. I'm going to tell you a little bit about, it's a way to organize, in a sense, some of the work we have done and over the years, and it sort of is brought together by this idea of a poverty trap. So what's a poverty trap? Well, let's start one step before. The question is, why are some people so poor? And I think there are really 2 answers to that question. One is, yes, people have, unfortunately, there's inequality in talent, and some people are just unable to function at a high level. If that were true, that would mean that to help them, you have to constantly continue to help them because they're not able to sustain themselves at a high level. So you can make them less poor, but to do that, you have to consistently keep providing them with resources, which may very well be acceptable or justified, but it's a very different world from the one where the other world, where they're poor because they're poor, or because their parents were poor. And there's a long tradition of work on that subject as well. What do I mean by they're poor because they're poor? There's the idea is that somehow because they are poor, they're unable to take advantage of opportunities offered by the economic system, and therefore they are unable to, find their way out of poverty, but a temporary boost, which then makes it easier for them to take advantage of the opportunities available to them, will allow them to find their way out of poverty. So in other words, temporary boosts in that world will have durable effects, which of course makes the economics of it much more attractive. This is a very stylized version of the idea of a poverty trap. What this represents is some what one might call a state variable, something about this generation, let's say, of the of a person's life versus, let's say, the next generation or 10 years later. The time is a bit arbitrary. So is, in a sense, the designation. It's not that one thing changes in people's life, many things change. But I think it's useful to still adopt the stylization of thinking that there is one state, their level of capital, their level of education, their level of human capital more generally, their level of productivity, something that's generated is currently given, and then what this curve is represents it is what would the future state of that be as a function of the current state, and it's some function which I won't really tell you anything about. It's that's not the subject of this, except that if that relationship has this shape, this concave shape, then it has a very specific implication, which is that you start poor, you climb. You can see that when k is below k star, to the left of k star, for those of you who are not used to reading these diagrams, kt plus 1 is bigger than kt, because that red line, or red brown line in the middle, is it represents the line on which kt is equal to kt plus 1. So it's the line that bisects that right angle. So it's the line on which the two, there would be, where that line intersects the curve of for kt plus 1 is where kt and kt plus 1 are equal. To the left of that point, kt plus 1 is bigger than kt. To the right of the point, kt plus 1 is smaller than kt. And that's just a way of saying that that means that over time, if you start to the left, you will get richer. At some point, that's going to stop. That's the place where it stop is called K star. Likewise on the other side. If you start any richer, you're going to get poorer till, of course, you end up in this place where things are stuck. That's different from if that curve happened to have, let's say, this shape, which is we will call an S shape, kind of, not for obvious reasons. And there you can see that the curve is first it's convex, then it's concave. I'll come back to the question of why the curve might have this shape or that shape, but what that curve does is it opens up another possibility. It opens up the possibility that there are now two intersections, actually three. One is 0, one is k star, and one is k double star, between the kt plus 1 curve and the red brown line. And what that implies is that if you started below k star, then you just get poorer and poorer. If you start above k star, then for a while you get richer, and then you stop. If you start above k double star, you actually go down and converge to k double star. This is a situation where both 0 and k double star are attractors. You can start from, if you're very poor, you essentially get stuck somewhere near 0. If you aren't very poor, you're just lucky enough to be above k star, then you climb a bit. And this is a society where there is divergence. And in particular, if someone who was below k star by some piece of luck or policy intervention ends up above k star, then they will then be lucky enough to end up at k double star. So that's the idea. It's not a particularly deep idea, but it's the idea that the shape of this relationship matters. The relationship between kt plus 1 and kt matters. If it is concave, it has one implication. If it's this S shaped, has a different implication. Why would this curve have this shape? Well, there's a long tradition of work on this, going back actually to the 1950s, where there was a number of scholars who were who made uh, the argument that nutrition might be a source of a poverty trap. So if you're starving, you can't be productive, and if you're not productive, then you won't have an income, so you will starve. This was the idea. In the 1950s. Number of economists, Harvey Leibenstein and Deepak Mazumdar, were economists who suggested this idea. This idea was given a more elaborate formalization in the 1980s in the work of Partha Dasgupta and Debraj Ray, and in Partha's book from 1993. And the argument is that this could be a source of a poverty trap. Um, this spurred a debate where T.N. Srinivasan, another renowned Indian economist who sadly passed away a few years ago, made the argument that while this is a fine idea, it's probably not true, because it's it's not the case that when nutrition improves, productivity grows up enough, or even when income improves, nutrition doesn't seem to improve so much. So for both directions, he was arguing what you need for a poverty trap is that at some point you have to have a picture which a part of the curve where KT plus 1 is increasing pretty fast. It's steeper than the red brown line. That means it's increasing as KT goes up, KT plus 1 goes up a lot. So meaning, suppose my parents are richer than my income or potential income, my earning capacity goes up pretty fast. If that's not the case, then you won't get a poverty trap if income doesn't go up fast enough. And I think there has been a long body of work suggesting that maybe while it is true that income increases nutrition and nutrition increases income, the effect isn't as dramatic as one would need to get a poverty trap. There's of course other ways to tell the story. You can have so you could tell a story in terms of potentially their inability to not so much to invest in your own health, but in terms of starting a business. Let's say, so if you are poor, then there's a minimum amount that you need to start a productive business, and if you're poor, you just don't get there. You don't have enough money to make the necessary investment. Therefore, even if you have a business, the business is one where there's not enough, there's just not enough, the inventory of the shop is not interesting enough to attract clients. The machine, there's no machine in the sewing business, so you end up using your hand stitching, and all of these are going to be relatively low productivity. Therefore, you will never get out of poverty. For this, again, the question is, of course, of evidence, and that's, of course, where I'm going to end up. So this is sort of prelude to talking about the evidence. But I think one of the things that makes this idea plausible is that at least for the poor, but really for most people, the ability to borrow, there's lots of evidence suggesting that the ability to borrow is limited. Why does that matter? It's because, in a sense, one solution to the problem of if I have a great idea or have a great project, I'm just a very good entrepreneur, the solution to my not being poor is being able to borrow. If I borrow, I'll have enough capital to make the necessary investments, and then it doesn't matter that I was poor. I would make the right investment, and then I would be productive, and I will stop being poor. So, so at the heart of the story is this idea of credit constraints, of being the idea that borrowing is hard, that credit is scarce, especially for poor people, and I think there's lots of evidence for that. So that was a prima facie a starting point for this kind of story. Come back to what we know a bit later. Other stories have been again suggested. One is that to be productive, to be successful, you have to take risks. But taking risks is difficult if you're very poor, because everything you do pushes you into a dire situation where you will end up in close to starvation. You'll end up close to not being able to feed your children, and the poor really are very vulnerable to that. There's some evidence, I think, again, that lack of exposure to risk makes poor people unwilling to take on high return projects. So there is, again, not proof that, as I was pointing out in the case of nutrition, we know that in the case of nutrition, there's also evidence that income, poor people eat too little, and that reduces the productivity. The T.N. Srinivasan's point was these are quantitatively not big enough to generate a poverty trap, that in the end the curve will look concave rather than convex. This is again an issue here. So question is not, we do believe that poor people are discouraged from taking risks. The question is, how much do we attribute to that risk? A third narrative, which is also, I think there is an interesting evidence supporting that this mechanism is at play. Again, not so clear that it's whether it's big enough. That's always the question that I'm going to spend time on, is it really the case that the mechanism will actually deliver a trap? And the idea here is that poverty is stressful. You spend lots of time worrying about how to make ends meet. So that makes long-term planning difficult, and making good decisions difficult. You're too stressed to have the kind of reflective space that allows you to take forward-looking decisions that will lift you out of poverty. Again, there is some evidence for this view. Very nice book by Mullainathan and Shafir on this. So the question that, as I've been hinting, I'm going to come to next, is how does one ever know that whether these turn into poverty traps or not? How do we know that are there poverty traps in the world? Are there people who are trapped in poverty because they happen to be born in poverty? And there's no perfect way to answer that question. The way I'm going to try to answer that question is by looking at the effect of a one-time shock. That and trying to understand if this one-time shock has a durable effect. Remember, in that picture we saw before, if you were below K star and I somehow managed to push you above K star, you will then durably end up at a place that's well above K star. That's the idea, that maybe when I one way to look for poverty traps is to look at the effect of a one-time shock. Now, problem with this, which is quite fundamental, is that, of course, we can only look for data. When I say I'm going to show you evidence, I mean I'm going to look at people's lives and maybe some years of their lives, but it's impossible, given the current state of data, to really have, you know, look at people over, you know, 10 generations. That's just not the kind of data we have. So anything that anything that will will we will be able to say is will have to be limited to, you know, few 10 years will be a long time in that, and I'll show you data for something like 10 years, but it's long-term effects is not quite it's not quite satisfactory, but it's not perfect. Well, but at least it does something, but it's not perfect. That's the reason why that's a concern, is that, you know, maybe you know, as a result of, you know, some intervention, a family that was very poor becomes less poor and stays less poor. The worry is that, you know, maybe that lasts for 10 years, maybe that lasts for 20 years, but maybe 40 years later, something awful happens and they fall back. Or conversely, a family that didn't get that help, who didn't emerge from the trap for, you know, now in 10 years, but maybe in 25 years they'll get something that will actually spring them from the trap. So that's a, in other words, there is going to be no perfect answer to this question. And I think that's worth acknowledging as we go forward, that this is going to be still limited to what we can do with the data we have. I think before I come to the evidence, let me say why this is important. One thing that's important from a very economist point of view is going to be important because it offers the possibility that a relatively small one-time push may set up a virtuous cycle. People will, in that picture, you would see the idea that, you know, when I push you over K, a small push that pushes you over K star now allows you to accumulate, and as you accumulate over time, you get richer and richer, and that makes it easier to accumulate over a range, and that's going to mean that you're going to get a lot richer. A small push can get you to be a lot richer. That doesn't mean you get rich, but it gets you a lot richer than you used to be, and that implies a very high social return on investment. I think the even more important point is 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 in a sense ideological, which is that I think it's very, I think in the way we think about the world, it's very important to 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 be able to hold on to the idea that even the poorest of the poor have enough talent to be sufficient, and no one is actually bereft of talent. It's just we live in a world where there's so much unfairness that the talent is often not uh, allowed to flourish. So everybody has the ability to earn a living. It's just some of them are placed in such circumstances that they don't manage. And I think that that's an important sort of starting point for any conversation about, you know, social policy or about the nature of our empathy. So with that background, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one program, and then I'll tell you a little bit about other evidence. One program that essentially tries to exactly do this. Starts directly. It's a program that was designed by BRAC, which is a remarkable NGO from Bangladesh, and it's the point of this program was to take the people who BRAC, which was a micro lender, but decided that these people are so poor that they couldn't even get micro loans. So they were identified to be the poorest of the poor, and BRAC decided for those people you couldn't give them a loan and expect them to react. They're just not in the right place. You needed to give them an asset to start with. So the program involves what they call the graduation program. It's a bit, the word graduation might confuse you, but it's the idea is graduating from extreme poverty to normal poverty. It's an interesting usage. It was targeted to the poorest of the poor. It was a package consisting of some assets, some training, and handholding. So training and handholding meaning, I'll give you an example, and some temporary cash assistance. The results I'm going to talk to you about come from a series of randomized controlled trials, large-scale social experiments where some people chosen at random were given these assets and others were, who didn't win the lottery were not. Sometimes this was done at a village level, meaning some villages the people got it, others didn't. But so the different ways of organizing the randomization, but all cases, this was done by randomizing the choice of beneficiaries to avoid the possibility that the beneficiaries would be selected in some specific way so that they would not be comparable to anyone else or anyone else that we know. So a lot of the assets were livestock, but for many of these people, at least the program that I know best, I know I worked on two of those programs, one in West Bengal, one in Ghana, and in both cases, this was a population of women who had been either abandoned by their husbands with young children, or the husband had died. Again, they typically had young children, or the husbands had mental illness or alcoholism. Uh, typically they had young children. They were identified by the villagers themselves. When we asked them the question, "Who among you are the poorest?" This was the answer to the question. These were women who were often typically in their 20s and 30s. They had never really made a living. They were married at 16 or 15 or 14 and without much education. And then when something happened to their husband, they were left in the lurch. And typically they survived by begging and other ways in which doing very small jobs for their neighbors. For these people, even owning a cow was a challenge because they really didn't know how to, vaccinate a cow. Where do you get a vaccine? Who vaccinates them? How do you milk a cow? How do you sell milk? So a lot of the hand-holding and training was telling them these are the steps you have to take. The hand-holding was kind of coming back and telling them, look, you can do it. Don't panic. It's not you have it in you to do it. And that was done by an employee of the NGO Bandhan Konnagar that was doing this in West Bengal. In addition, so there was a cow, there was training, and there was some temporary cash assistance, temporary meaning typically 6 to 9 months, where before the cow starts giving milk, you're not going to get anything from it. You have to feed the cow. So this was to make sure that in the short run, the problem wasn't made worse by giving them the cow. So what do we find? We find across most countries, out of the 6 countries, the households that are chosen to be beneficiaries own more productive assets. Interesting, they work longer hours, they earn more, and they're happier. And happier meaning they answer self-reported well-being questions of a variety of kind and depression questions, and there are typically positive effects on that, and they're healthier. These are results from 5 of those countries. There's the results or 6 of those countries. The results from Bangladesh are actually very similar to that one in India, but they were in a different study, and so they're not included here. Consumption goes up almost everywhere except in Honduras, and where we have income measures, income goes up. This is after 2 years of the program. This is after 3.5 years of the program. You see that we see effects on income in most countries, many countries, though the data is less. Now the data is actually available from most of the places, and it looks more similar in most of the countries, and Honduras still looks bad. 10 years, we've now tracked these people for 10 years, both the treatment group, the people who got the assets and the people who didn't. And we see that consumption per head and income per head are about 30% higher. Now, this was not very different. We have data at 1.5 years after the program, 3 years after the program, and 7 years after the program. For consumption, as I said, the effect is similar. Income, the impact is actually bigger now than it was in year 3. Similar results from Bangladesh. I'm going to skip this data. It's too hard to read, but you'll see some of it as I go. Interestingly, this is happening in a context where even those who didn't get the assets are doing better. So it's not the case that one group is just stuck where it was. They are getting some help. And you might have imagined that that would lead to convergence. They're getting mostly what's happening is, for example, 2 things are critical. One is that the public, this is a period where the National Rural Employment Guarantee is introduced. So income sources are from the public sector are more available to low-income population. And second, the Indian economy is growing relatively fast, at least till 2016, and that's generating employment opportunities. And a lot of the younger people from these families are traveling elsewhere to work and earn income. So in both ways, even those who didn't get the asset are better off. What's interesting, and in some ways it points to the oversimplification of the idea of a poverty trap as a static phenomenon, is that the people who get the asset are still ahead. They continue to be ahead. They continue to be, as I said, 30% odd richer. And that's just the data. You can see that it's roughly the gap is just shifting up, grows between, this is per capita consumption, the gap grows, and it stays more or less the same between years 7 and 10. This is income, and this is food security. Again, this is share of households reporting every member gets enough to eat. It's true in both the red people, who are the people who didn't get the asset, and the people who did. Both of them benefit, but you see that it continues to be the case that that the blue group does better. That's true in monthly household income, where the effects are larger, somewhat larger. Interestingly, I remember the story I told you. A story I told you is that maybe what's happening is that these people are unable to start a business, but when they get this asset, they get some extra wealth, and maybe their business, one cow turns into 5 cows because cows breed, and then that's their business. And so you could imagine a world where, once I give you an asset, that asset itself becomes your livelihood. Interestingly, now, of course, I didn't say that. When I drew the picture, I drew something called K, which could be different things in different periods of people's lives. I didn't say anything about that very specifically links the K to anything very concrete. But it's interesting to see that in fact, what's happening is that at 18 months, the income gain from this intervention is coming from livestock and a little bit from non-livestock businesses. They're already starting to set up non-livestock businesses. So at 3 years, the big gain in income is coming from the business. So with the earnings from the livestock, they're setting up, or the confidence from having the livestock, or the assurance of a security from having the livestock. People are starting to have a non-livestock business, and that's where at 3 years the gains are. That's even more true at 7 years. At uh, at at 10 years, you start to see a different pattern, which is that you see that or even at 7 years, you start to see that these people are earning more from wages. So that's mostly driven by the fact that these families are aging, their children are no longer content to do what their parents are doing, and they are often immigrating to other parts of India, to different urban agglomerations to earn a higher income, and that's the at the heart of it. You start to see that this is a generational shift where the business becomes actually less important as a source of extra earnings. The income. So between year and 3 and 7, you diversify into micro business. Between 7 and 10, you're focused in wage employment. Interestingly, it's not the business that's driving it anymore. It's the migration earnings. And one of the things that's very clear is that what's driving this turns out to be this is in West Bengal. Remember, I said it's in this study is in Murshidabad district of West Bengal. We see that over time, the number of days of wage employment remain roughly stable from year 3 to year 10. You don't see the treated group works longer. Mostly the earnings come from migrating. They're all migrating to urban centers. The real difference is that in year 10, they're much less likely to migrate to Kolkata. They're much more likely to migrate to places like, Mumbai, Surat, Trivandrum. They're going further. The asset has the fact that the family has an asset has given them some confidence, or some, maybe just the ability to pay for a train ticket, or the ability to go and spend a few days looking for a job somewhere. So they're going further, and that seems to be the key driver. Now, interestingly, they are still working harder. This is worth commenting because there is ongoing prejudice against giving money to the poor, which comes from the idea that if you give them something free, they'll become lazy. We see no evidence of that. They're working harder. At all stages of this, they're working harder. If you take the cost benefit of this intervention, this is the point I was making about the social returns on a transfer are very high. If this 30% gap is in perpetuity, this would be a return of 1,100%. If it just ends after 10 years, it would still have given us a return of about 380% on the money that they were given. That's true in many countries, but not all of them. In some of them, the rate of return is actually not as high. And part of the reason why the rate of return isn't that high is that this, what I call hand holding and training, is actually quite expensive. And in countries where that kind of skill is scarce, it turns out this program isn't that productive. Net return might be. It's worth emphasizing that durable long-term effects are a necessary condition for high returns, but not a sufficient condition, because the returns could be durable but not very high. It's also striking to note that the effects are for everyone. This is the treatment effects, the effect of the intervention by quantile, meaning the bottom 20%, the next 20%, the next 20%, these are in color coded. And you can see that essentially every group benefits. Not necessarily all the poorest benefit less than the richest of these very poor people, but everyone benefits. And that's reassuring. It suggests that there is, it goes back to the point I was making, that there's talent even among the poorest, if you like, that everyone is able to do better. This is in income. I won't spend too much time on it because I want to maybe leave a little bit of time for questions. This is very similar results from Bangladesh. Durable effects after 7 years. What's nice about the Bangladesh study is that the data is on what happens to assets is much better, and you can see that essentially there's a lot of land acquisition that's happening, something that's not really happening so much in West Bengal or in many other places in Bangladesh. The poorest are actually buying some land as a this is what I had shown you in the abstract. This is estimated from the Bangladesh data. What's on the horizontal axis is KT, if you like. It's baseline productive assets, land, cows, tractors, etc. On the horizontal axis is 4 years later their productive assets. And the point to note is that this relationship is convex at the bottom, very flat, and then going up quite steeply and then flat again. This is exactly the picture one expects when there's a poverty trap. One other interesting point that the Bangladesh study makes is that if you think about what a curve like this implies, it implies that people who are going to be around where K hat is in that picture are going to be either heading to lower and lower or higher and higher. In other words, they should be emptying out of the distribution from the middle. And that's sort of what we see. We see that there are some clusters the distribution looks like this. It looks like this both in treatment and control. In treatment, the distribution is a bit shifted to the right. And that's what you'd expect. You'd expect that the treatment, the assets are high. So one of the ideas that's often associated with, the story I just told, which is of, maybe people are, they need assets, but they don't have enough credit to get assets. So that story was very important in the policy space. And the argument that was being made for a very long time, starting around the mid-90s, was that the right way to solve that problem is microfinance. Microfinance is the idea of giving people small loans, not unsecured loans, where it's been shown that the repayment rates are high. Grameen Bank, for those of you who are sort of familiar with it, is a micro lender. You could imagine So the question I want to sort of relate this into to the previous evidence. Do we see does the presence the intervention of microfinance support the evidence I just cited, which is that there might be a poverty trap? So this was a randomized controlled trial. 52 neighborhoods out of 104 were given access to microfinance. There is no impact on average or median outcomes. Strikingly, we don't find that people get richer or poorer. However, we see that some people who are right at the very top of the distribution of people who got microfinance, they're all still very poor people, but among them, those who were already business owners and who had some assets, extra assets, were the only people, the top 5% of the population really benefits. And this would be consistent with a view which says that since credit comes with a cost, you have to repay it. So, it's not like getting an asset. So the equivalent of getting credit in terms of getting an asset is much lower. So if you get 20,000 rupees in credit, most of that money has to be paid back. So you're not really, the net amount you're getting is small. The equivalent of getting a cow is actually, getting a fair amount of credit, and only the people who already had some access to credit and some capital of their own really could use this money. That would be consistent with this S-shaped view, which is that you need a push to be pushed to be high enough to benefit from it, and we see exactly that, which is the top 5% benefit, the rest don't. And this from that data, what we find is that in the treatment and control, the relationship between baseline assets and future assets, again 10 years later, assets 10 years later, has this S shape. The people in treatment, that curve is shifted to the right. So again, the shifted to the left, shifted to the left because they're getting some extra credit. So in addition to the assets that they owned, their net assets are a bit higher because the credit is adding to that. So that's why they can start climbing out of the poverty trap a bit earlier. So in other words, microfinance is an instrument. It can help the people who are close enough to that K star to escape, but it doesn't help the others. Another question that we may want is, the package I told you, there was hand-holding, there was this cash support. There's one study where we compared it with giving people just an asset without the hand-holding, and there we find no durable effects. Is that the end of the story? No, but I think it's not implausible that for this population where really the self-confidence is low, these are people who have never really earned a living before, or many of them, it's not clear that just an asset would do. So maybe we do need the whole. A final point I want to make is that I've been telling you a story about credit, and indeed credit probably plays an important role. It's if you get credit, as I said, for the richest people, getting a boost of credit helps. For the very poor people, we have some evidence suggesting that the effect operates through actually cheering people up, that they are actually more productive per minute, not because they can buy better machines or better inputs, but just because we did an experiment where we gave them the machines and the input. It turns out that even in that space where they didn't need to invest, they were more productive, and it seemed to be because they were simply more enthusiastic about doing things. So just a psychological mechanism. So to conclude, it is possible to durably increase earnings. In other words, there does seem to be some evidence of a poverty trap, at least for the poorest of the poor. This is, I should emphasize, this is not, these were people who were selected to be poor among the set of poor people. But it's, for these people at least, you do see some effect that seems like a poverty trap, and it might suggest that maybe when we think of social policy, we should think of how to give these people a real fresh start in life, a big push. Big doesn't have to be really big, it has to be just enough to get them, give them a start. And then we see that that might actually have durable and very rewarding effects. So I'll stop there.
It was a very nice lecture, Professor Banerjee.
Thank you.
I have a question of the future of jobs in India. And given that about 40% of India is either unemployed or unemployable, how do you scale up your experiment to handle India in the, say, 2050? And just a late question is, when you talk about migration, you are also looking at social stresses that are induced by migration, which will have a negative feedback effect.
Let me disagree with both parts of your question. I don't think it is true that 40% are unemployed. Unfortunately, we have almost no social support. So, most people don't survive. If you look at our job earning profile, I mean, the pandemic has created its own issues. The problem isn't that there is people are unemployed. It's most males above 30 are employed. Most meaning, if you look at the NSS, the unemployment rates are 2 to 3%. If you look at more skilled populations, there was more unemployment, but that's partly because, or more skilled, maybe there's some question about the skills, but that may be partly because they are looking for better jobs, and we have some evidence suggesting that people are quite picky about what jobs they get. But at least the poor are people with less than 10 years of education. There's almost no unemployment among them. The real problem is not as much that as first skilling, which we are doing pretty badly. As you said, they may not be employable in any meaningful sense despite their qualification. And second, there's a mismatch between locations. So the jobs are concentrated in some places and not others. There's a huge mismatch. So the migration is a source of earnings for a very large part of states like West Bengal, Bihar, UP, Odisha. There are young people. Now, do we? I want to reason why. I mean, I think that we should. It would be, I think, desirable if jobs could be, created everywhere. But I think if you look at a pattern worldwide, this is one thing that hasn't succeeded. There's almost nowhere in the world where you haven't seen an increasing geographical concentration of jobs. Only, in a sense, engineered exception is China, which has created many, many big cities everywhere to in a sense, distribute the population. But still, China has, a huge part of the world's biggest cities now as a result of that. So it's not, so again, by controlling migration by draconian means, they have managed to limit everybody ending up in Shanghai. But as a result, they've created mega cities which have their own problems. I have not seen a country. The US has the same problem. UK has the same problem. France has the same problem. Geographical concentration in some areas. So I don't expect that to be something that we're going to solve. So I think we need to mediate the social stresses by other means. And in particular, my sense is that while there are occasional flare-ups, you can see that in Maharashtra, for example, the Shiv Sena government, which was at some point in its history much more, the Shiv Sena was much an anti-migrant party, was very proactive in trying to protect the migrants in this current wave of the pandemic. And I think that's not a, I think that's the right way for us to go, rather than trying to limit migration. I don't think it will A, be good for the economy, B, I think it will be almost surely unimplementable.
So there are three questions on the chat box. I'll read them one at a time. The first question is, what determines the kind of transition dynamics curves that exist in society? And this is from Professor Vishnu Krishnan.
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think probably many things. I mean, as one would imagine, it's not going to be one story. I think for some people, it's a lack of, cultural capital. The parents don't. If your parents don't have books at home, it's that much harder to get, to benefit from education. For others, probably it's lack of money. Yes, yet others, it may well be that you grow up in conditions of stress, and that makes you less able to handle further stress. I think there are many hypotheses, and my guess is eventually we'll get better at identifying them. And if I had to take a guess, I would say probably all of them will show up. But I don't have a at all. I wish I knew the answer to that, but I don't.
Before I read the second question, can I ask you a question, Professor Banerjee? If somebody is on your S curve and that person crosses the K double star, did I get you right that you said that after a while they'll get back to K double star even after they overshoot K double star?
Surely. I mean, there might well be. I limited the set of curves to be curves which have 1 point of inflection. You could draw curves which have 10 points of inflection, in which case they might cross K double star and then get to K triple star and K. There's nothing. This was illustrative rather than substantive. But yes, as drawn, K double star is drawn in a way that says that that's the above that if you start with K above that, then the next generation will have a lower K than you started with, or the next.
So why is it not possible that it is monotonically increasing after K double star?
It could be convex all the way. As I said, I drew the curve to have, one point of inflection, but with two steady states. I could have. There's nothing in the nature. We know so little about the rich that I would not even hazard to say how that functions. I mean, the rich don't answer surveys. We know very little about them. They're immune to the kinds of research that well, pretty much all kinds of research. It's not that there's much. We know very, very little about them, especially in a country like India where there's really no data about them. So I can't say that I know what the curve looks like on the extreme right. I only know what it looks like at the left.
So I'll read the second question in the chat box. How the direct benefit transfer to the poor will create benefit or help in creating assets by the poor? This policy is being followed by the government of India.
Correct. So I think the direct benefit transfer is in a sense, it's an attempt to substitute from more targeted programs. So we used to get whatever subsidies in cooking gas. Now you're supposed to get that in your bank account. It's not so much a matter of changing mean, there is some additional subsidy being provided, but most of this is just changing the nature of the subsidy to reduce the you know, it was used to be much more controlling. You get only your subsidy in this form or that, and now there's an attempt to reduce that. It does have the advantage that, you know, it's something that if you happen to be in the right place, you may be able to save it and buy an asset with it because it's money rather than, you know, this good or that good. But for the most part, it's right now it's small amounts of money. I don't think it's yet in a place where it's going to have major effects. I think the big programs of the government really are still PDS, which is the sort of the big income support program, and NREGA. These are the two biggest programs, and I think that those are the places where people do. Those are the programs that do affect. I think and then neither of those are DBTs. They are really, you know, one is a workfare program. You work to get paid. The other is a in-kind program. So neither of them is a DBT. I think there's a philosophy of moving to DBT, but we haven't gone very far there.
All right, I'll read the next question in the chat box, which is kind of long, but I'll try and read it fast. Is there any check on the treatment being allocated to the poverty-stricken population who tend to use that kind of financial and capital help to meet up their previous loans and or waste it on various purposes, in parentheses, substance consumption, small money lending businesses, to name a few, parenthesis closed, thus creating an impedance in long-term sustainable business and a consequent decrease in the net investment money for business?
I think this is a view that I think the evidence is very much against. So I think there are actually many studies. The World Bank has a paper which is on asks a very narrow question. Does giving cash transfers to people increase their consumption of controlled substances, alcohol, drugs, etc.? And the answer is no. Cigarettes, there is no evidence of it. They kind of do a pretty systematic job of it. So I don't think there's any evidence of that, nor is there any evidence of, you know, their or nor is there any, let's say, compelling evidence of their wasting. In fact, what's interesting is that if you look at the effects of cash transfers, what's striking is that you might imagine that the first rupee I get, I buy food with it. So the ratio of food spending to other spending should go down as I get richer. It's not true. When people get it seems like people are under pressure to meet various social needs, but when they get extra money, they often spend more of it on food or on nutrition. So there's really no reason to be that pessimistic.
So I'll ask the last question. You gave us 15 minutes, and we're getting there. So I'm skipping a few questions, but here's an interesting one, a different one from the previous ones. How did you handle the ethical issue of offering benefit only to some and merely observing the fate of the control group?
It's not that we had infinite resources. So what could we do? I mean, the resources were very limited. You could either give it to people or not. The alternative, the choice for us was to walk away from this program. And it's not that we implemented it. We didn't choose it. An NGO got funding to do a certain number of households. It did it. The rest of the households we did it, there was no money for it, and therefore there were two choices. One is to not give anyone anything. The other is to give some people a cow. Giving half a cow doesn't quite work. So I don't think I didn't feel particularly troubled by this. I think this is, in fact, if you see the sheer randomness of of the distribution of benefits that come from all programs. Everybody in India is used to the fact that, oh well, you know, mera number to nahi aaya. So I feel that that's a bit that's maybe unfortunate, but it's certainly not the case that we were generating massive unexpected randomness in an otherwise extremely well-regulated and stable world.
All right, we'll stop there. And again, I take this opportunity on behalf of the entire fellowship and associateship of the Indian Academy of Sciences to thank you for your time. It was just absolutely stunning and wonderful. We learned a lot from your talk, and we hope that in the future you will continue to engage with us. Thank you very much. You have a nice day.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much for those questions.